All right, let's do this, shall we? Welcome to the Blazor Desk Show. I'm Carl Franklin, and I'm going to run through a lot in the next couple of hours. But I wanted to personally welcome you to the Blazor Desk Show. Of course, this started as the Blazor Road Show, but there was this little matter of a coronavirus that got in our way. So we're doing multiple events online for your enjoyment and education. I am going to tell you everything I know. I'm going to share everything I know about Blazor. Prepare to drink from the fire hose, but you do not have to worry about missing anything. There's no FOMO here, no fear of missing out, because if you just go to blazordeskshow.com, not only will you be able to see and download a PDF version of this slideshow, which has all the links, you'll also be able to download a hands-on lab and the source code. And somebody just asked me in the Twitch chat room, how are you feeling? Doing today? Family's good? I'm good. I have been diagnosed with coronavirus, but my symptoms are all but gone now, and I think I'm out of the weeds. So that's good. Thank you for asking. Hope you guys are staying healthy and following the guidelines as well. So just to reiterate that last point, all of the code, the hands-on labs, and this document, this PowerPoint presentation in PDF format are available free for download at blazordeskshow.com. Also there you will see a link to DevExpress's. Let's get DevExpress on the screen here. DevExpress's free Blazor tools, which is something that I'm gonna prove the value of them today by showing you everything about Blazor, doing it without third-party tools, and then some amazing demos that we're going to save you a lot of time. More about the free Blazor tools in a minute, but Don has posted, Don Webier has posted in YouTube the link to get those free Blazor controls, and he'll actually post them on Twitch as well. More about that later. Let's talk about Blazor. So Blazor, for most people who are paying attention, it represents C# in the browser. Okay? And that's how it started with Steve Sanderson's demo at NDC Oslo a couple of years ago. He did this great demo, and I just remember Microsoft guys in the room, their heads exploding. They're like, "Oh my God, this changes everything!" Of course, he could only do a few things because he didn't have the library and the base class library in there. It was just a rudimentary kind of example, but it was pretty impressive. So he was writing against WebAssembly, and WebAssembly is the browser version of Blazor that we're all kind of thinking about and familiar with right now. But Blazor has evolved into a component model, and they said they were going to do this right at the bat. They think that there was an opportunity to create a new component model and a new market for third-party components, and sure shooting there is a new market for third-party components. The component model itself is how you interact with markup, which is HTML, and code, which is C#. And those two things can be packaged together into assemblies and shared. Make NuGet packages out of them, whatever. That component model right now, and I really have to stress this right off the bat, this component model is ready to ship. Like, it isn't going to change between now and November when .NET 5 comes out and .NET Blazor WebAssembly is actually in the framework. Right now it's in preview. So the component model itself, we've been assured from Microsoft, that isn't going to change. What will change possibly in May for WebAssembly is the plumbing underneath the Blazor projects. That may change, but the actual component model itself, the way you bind, the way you write code and call it, that is all done. So that's a really important point, because now that means you can be sure that any Blazor code and markup pages, components, whatever that you write today against the WebAssembly preview, those are going to run just fine in November when the whole thing is in the box. So that's a really important point. That means that now is a really good time, folks, for you to get hip to Blazor and to download it and use it and learn all you can about it. And I suppose that's why you're here. So there are two hosting models now. The WebAssembly hosting model is pretty easy to understand. The C# code runs in the browser. But Blazor Server is another hosting model, and this one was finished and launched with .NET Core 3. And so if you have .NET Core 3, Visual Studio 2019, you can create a Blazor Server application. Now that uses the same component model as you would use in WebAssembly. In fact, you could actually use DLLs that you've created for WebAssembly, run them on server, or vice versa. So this is the critical piece of it, is this component model. Now the same markup and code will run in either model, but you don't want to combine models. You wouldn't, you can't really. I mean, think about it. This is a user interface SPA framework, like Angular is with JavaScript, React, all of these binding, UI, updating models for the web, they all use JavaScript for the most part. And so this is one of the first SPA models that gets away from JavaScript. So you might be thinking, come on, Carl, this is just the next version of Silverlight, right? Is this gonna, is Microsoft gonna decide we're not going to support this anymore and pull the rug out from under us? Because I know there's a lot of old pain out there, mine included. I built a lot of stuff on Silverlight. Now, first of all, let's unwrap this whole thing, because it's a little bit silly. First of all, Microsoft didn't pull out the rug from under anybody. The reason that Silverlight became non-viable as a platform wasn't because it was C# code in the browser. It was because it was using the same vector to get into the browser that Flash was using, namely the plugin model. And the plugin model turned out to be very insecure. So there was two problems for Steve Jobs and his decision to stop supporting the plugin model in Safari iOS, the browser that runs on iPhones and iPads, was based on two things. First was Flash was very popular, and people were watching movies and videos with Flash, and it was very CPU intensive, so it was draining the battery on these little devices, which were struggling anyway. Okay, so that was problem number one. Problem number two, and don't worry, my lights are flashing, so you don't worry about that. Problem number two was that malware was getting in via the plugin model, and mostly because of Flash. Silverlight was just, it wasn't being as utilized as much as Flash was. So those were the reasons that he decided to stop supporting the plugin model in iOS versions of Safari, and most of the other browsers followed suit. It was a security threat, and Silverlight was a casualty of that decision. And it was the right decision, actually, because, nobody wants malware and nobody wants their battery draining. So I can see where Silverlight's past and Blazor WebAssembly's future could get conflated. But let's talk about the difference between WebAssembly and the plugin model. First of all, they're huge. WebAssembly is a virtual machine that runs in every browser. Now, when I say every browser, I mean every browser that is currently in development. It is a standard. It's there. It's there on Safari, iOS. It's there in Chrome. It's there in Edge. It's there in Firefox, in Mozilla. It's in every browser that people use that is being updated. What isn't being updated is Internet Explorer. And I know there's a lot of companies out there that still use and support Internet Explorer 11. Well, there's always the Blazor server hosting model that you can use for your Internet Explorer customers. And yes, you can build a WebAssembly version of a Blazor app and a server version of a Blazor app at the same time, and I'm going to show you how to do that today. Another benefit of doing this sort of parallel development, is that you can hedge your bets as to which hosting model you want to use, when shipping day comes. So we'll talk about that today, but I really just want to stress very much that WebAssembly is a standard. It's a VM that's built in. It's cross-platform. It's built into every browser that you care about, and it has the same security boundaries as JavaScript. So essentially, this opens up browser development to languages beyond JavaScript. And I heard an anecdote that the guys who made Docker said, if we had WebAssembly in 2008, we never would have made Docker. I got to find a reference to that, but it's an anecdote, so take it as you will. But anyway, WebAssembly is the shiz, and it may revolutionize the way we think of development in general, not just web development. That's what I think. All right, so if you're going to build a Blazor server application, you can do that today with Visual Studio 2019. But if you want to build a WebAssembly app, you have to do a couple of things. And there's a URL here, or if you just Google Bing WebAssembly Preview 3, Blazor WebAssembly Preview 3, you'll get this link. And it has the instructions to do this. Essentially, you install the latest .NET Core 3.1 SDK. You install the latest Visual Studio 2019 Preview, and the Community Edition works fine. You got to install the latest one to get the newer features here. And then the Blazor WebAssembly template, which you can do from the command line. And after you do that, and you maybe with a reboot, maybe not, you can create a Blazor WebAssembly application. So we're going to talk about the differences between hosting models here. And we're going to start with the server hosting model. The server hosting model doesn't use, well, first of all, the server hosting model, all the code is running on the server, whereas with WebAssembly, it runs in the browser. How does that work, and how can it be the same model? Well, they put some magic in here. It's SignalR. The WebSockets make it possible for a persistent socket connection between each client and the server to exist. And that persistent connection, it's a WebSocket. So just like SignalR, you can send messages in both directions as long as they're connected. That means that there isn't any HTTP client requirements. There's no, HTTP requests and responses that you have to worry about. There's no threading code with the UI. When stuff comes in from an API call, now you need to synchronize it with the UI. There's none of that plumbing. So just to show you what this is all about, let's go to Visual Studio right now and create a new project. And I'm going to create a Blazor application here, and it's going to be called Blazor Server. And I'll install it in my working directory here. And I get the option to do a Blazor Server app, and because I've installed that template, I can also do a Blazor WebAssembly app. So I'm going to make a Blazor Server app. And I'm just going to run it. Now, out of the box, you get this sort of template that has a demo built into it, essentially. But we're going to talk about all the different pieces of this and how it works. So first thing, right off the bat, I want to show you the 3 pages that you get here. And they're listed over here in the Pages folder: index, counter, and fetch data. So index is just some static stuff. Counter enables you to increment a counter by clicking a button. You can see that count increments right there. And fetch data goes and gets some data from a service. Now let's look at this code. In particular, the counter code, because this is a typical UI interaction, right? So this is essentially just HTML. I've got, a header up here and a paragraph where I'm showing the value of this variable with that razor syntax right there. The variable is current count. It's an integer. And when I click the button, it's going to call increment count, which increments that value. Now, you don't see any HTTP requests and responses here. You don't see any plumbing code. You don't see any threading code. You don't see any of that. All you're doing is you've got some, a one-way binding right here. And this @on click essentially tells Blazor that this is some server-side code running. There's no run @ equals server. There's no ceremony like that. It just works. So with that convention, basically, and you see it turn green, that means that's Blazor stuff happening there. So this magic is really incredible. Let's take a look at this file right here, underscore host.cshtml. This is the default route. When you come to a page, this is like your hello world page or whatever. This is the first thing that loads. So you have a header here, no big whoop there, some CSS. And in the body, you've got some code to display errors right there. And then you've got the main app, which this guy right there, this app, that is essentially your markup encode, all of it in that one object, app. And now this right here, this JavaScript, is what hooks the DOM and handles the calls back and forth with SignalR. That SignalR, and get this, I'm going to bring up this this model right here. SignalR is built in to .NET Core, the .NET Core Blazor server infrastructure. And you get this hub for free. Now, it isn't something that you can hook yourself to send your own messages. You can log it and you can see what's going on, going back and forth, but it's not for you. It's for Blazor. It's for the UI interaction. You can add your own SignalR hub if you want and do your own thing with it. That's no big deal. But there is one built in just for this one-to-one communication. And it is one-to-one. Typically, SignalR is used, like a chat application. That's the canonical example, where you've got a hub, and then every, client can type a message, goes to the hub, and then gets broadcast out to all the other clients. And that's not how it works here. This is one-to-one. So there is a hub, yes, but the communication is only server to one particular client. And there's a different, obviously, connection for every client. Why did I do that? I don't know. All right, so getting back to Visual Studio. Let's actually take a look at what happens here and see the magic before our eyes. I'm going to run this again, and I'll pull up the network tab in the tools, browser tools. I've got the cache disabled here because I want to see everything that comes across. And I'm just going to press the record button, and I'll go to the counter page, and I'll press Control F5 to do a complete refresh that gets me everything. And let's take a look at how much data was transferred. Wow, only 146K. All right, very, very fast startup time because not a whole lot of data was sent over. All the code's running on the server, remember that. This is the interesting part right here. This underscore Blazor ID equals yada, yada, yada. That is the WebSocket SignalR. And I'll clear all the messages here. and click the counter button, and then we'll go see what was sent. So first, when I clicked that counter button, the JavaScript hooked the DOM and said, oh, well, that's an @on click. I'm going to send that up to Blazor. Now, I'm not telling you exactly what all these messages are, but I'm giving you the flow of it, right? So it knows, the JavaScript knows that this is a Blazor thing, and it sends a binary message. You can see it's uploading there with a green arrow up, 290 bytes. And that is to say, hey, Blazor, the user clicked the button. Okay. Now the user clicks the button, and the SignalR hub sends a message. The SignalR sub sends a message to Blazor here, and it says, "Oh, the user clicked the button." And then SignalR says, Blazor says, "Oh, well, I need to call the increment count on the server." So it runs that, and as it increments, it notices, oh, this affects the DOM. So I'm going to have to send a message back to the user, to the browser, to update the DOM because I know this change. Well, how does it know? Well, Blazor server keeps a graph of the client's DOM in memory. And so what it does is it applies whatever code to the DOM on its side, and then it takes a diff, and it says, whoa, this right here has changed. So it sends back, and now you can see there are more messages here, but they're just keep alive messages. It sends down this 148 byte message that says, update the DOM. Here's what needs to update. And then an acknowledgement. I don't know exactly what this is, but it looks like an acknowledgement. And these 3 byte messages are just, keep alives. So not a whole lot of data happening here, right? It's very, very efficient. And that's what I wanted to get across to you in this particular demo. Let's move on. Let's talk about, that was the good side of Blazor Server, and let's talk about the issues that we have to deal with. One of them is scaling up and scaling out. So memory is probably the biggest variable that you have to consider in your server. How much memory you have greatly shapes how many concurrent clients you can have. So therefore, you want to be resourceful with memory. You don't want to load 1 million rows and send it down to the user in a gigantic list box. That would be irresponsible. You want to use controls that do paging. You want to search for things to narrow down the set of data that you want to handle and show the user at any one time. WebSockets. Oh, and by the way, yeah, 85K. There's an 85K minimum overhead per concurrent connection, per client. All right. It's not that bad, but everything's relative, right? If you have the memory to support it, great. Now, WebSockets are another issue. I'm going to copy this here. I guess I'm not. WebSockets are another issue, and SignalR has a limit. And the way to get around this is to, well, increase memory and CPU load. You can do that. But if you want to completely remove that SignalR for UI from the Blazor server itself, you can use Azure SignalR service. And this link right here will bring you to a page that shows you exactly how to do that. There's some secret sauce and a connection string and things that you have to figure out, but it's very easy to do. So here is a really good test, a test that was done by Microsoft, and these are the results. I stole this from Dan Roth, who delivered this slide at .NET Conf in January, and they did a test, essentially, for Blazor Server at scale. They wanted to see how many clients they could have with a particular configuration before latency grew above 200 milliseconds for a button click. And this was a real application. There was something like 165K of memory overhead per client. I can't remember exactly. You could actually do the math here. But with a server that had one virtual CPU and 3.5 gigs of RAM, they could support 5,000 concurrent connections comfortably. And that's not with SignalR service. That's just with SignalR that's in the box. With a 4 virtual CPU, 14 gig box, they could support 20,000. And again, this is a real application. This wasn't just like counter clicks. They actually had some real UI in here. And so they wanted to get a little benchmarking happening to see, what the limits were. So memory, if you're considering just using one server, memory and CPU are going to be your friend. If you want a cluster, right, that's fine. You're definitely going to want to use Azure SignalR service for that. And you're going to want to scale out the state, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So we'll talk about the pros and the cons of this hosting model, the server-side hosting model. First of all, the benefits. Download size, significantly smaller than a WebAssembly app. The app loads much faster. You have everything's running on the server, so all the benefits of server-side development apply, right? Everything that you can do on the server, which means database access and access to cloud services that require authentication and all that kind of stuff. This is all good that it's happening on the server. You're already there. You don't need to have any kind of API layers or anything like that. You can support thin clients or browsers that don't support WebAssembly, like Internet Explorer 11. Requires a polyfill, though. And this is important for some people. The code isn't sent to the browser, whereas in Blazor WebAssembly, the DLLs are downloaded into the browser. I don't think this is an issue personally because, the same rules apply with JavaScript. You wouldn't have secrets in your JavaScript, even if they were minified. You wouldn't have them in your JavaScript so that people can pull them out and compromise your system. It just makes sense. So the code, JavaScript code is UI code. Blazor code is UI code. All right, good. The downsides of Blazor Server, there's a little bit of latency added for each UI interaction because we have to go to that SignalR hub and everything, all the UI interactions run on the server. So it isn't like, and people get confused, it's not like you're calling an API from the client, right? You're not calling back to the server for data. Well, you might be, but you're not doing that from the client. Like all of it, all the UI interaction from the button click to the list box selection to the checkbox, all of those require a round trip. Now, while you're there, you're going to get some data probably and populate some things, but it's all about UI. I have to keep iterating that. So there's no offline support with Blazor Server, and that means if your internet goes down, your app stops working, right? So that means you want to do an assessment of your current situation. Who is your audience? If your audience is B2B and B2C customers, or you're behind the firewall doing an internal application, that we want to use at home, and it's a good bet that everybody who's going to use it has a good and solid internet connection, great. But if you're going to do something that's going to, exist with people mobile out in the field based on, their phone data plans, well, maybe not. Maybe not. But those are just things that you need to consider. Scalability is also a challenge. I just mentioned those scaling factors, the memory and WebSockets. Total number of WebSockets is based on memory and CPU usage anyway, so it really comes down to memory. And also it requires an ASP.NET Core server. just for UI interaction. So there isn't any packaging up like you can do with HTML and JavaScript and just send it to somebody and they can run it. Put it on a CDN, for example. You can't do that with Blazor Server. It does require a server. And that server, is going to be loaded up. So before we move on to WebAssembly and we show that and talk about that model a little bit more, are there any other questions that Don hasn't answered that you'd like to ask? Anyone? Anyone? I'll wait for the, we have a delay, so. Hopefully you can see the upsides and downsides of this model. As BP Merkel says, one of the unsung benefits of Blazor server applications, the productivity gains of not having to implement a presentation API. Absolutely. Absolutely. You do not need an API. And look at how beautiful the component model is with just a complete lack of plumbing code. You can really focus on your application. With Blazor server-side, is there a way to push out new versions without kicking everyone off the app? I'm going to let Don answer that one, but my answer right now is that reloading the app, just pressing F5 is probably going to be required. So, yeah, you replace it. That's right. And they're going to have to refresh to get the new versions. But you can do little things like you can use SignalR to send message to the clients that there's a new version. Would you please refresh? There is that. So also, you're not going to be able to maintain that SignalR connection indefinitely. After a certain while, you're going to time out, and it's going to say, the connection is down or whatever, needs to be reloaded. Press reload, press F5. So, other questions? Any Angular users? Anybody love JavaScript? Anyone? We're the JavaScript lovers. I know you're out there. Look, as we get into WebAssembly, every once in a while I get, what's wrong with just doing it in JavaScript? And the answer is nothing, absolutely nothing. And especially, a lot of companies have invested a lot of money into, Angular training and all of this stuff, or maybe using React or Vue or whatever it is that you're using, and go for it. If your team is head down in JavaScript and you've got a handle on it, that's great. But I'm telling you, there are lots, and I mean lots, hundreds of thousands of corporate developers out there that don't like JavaScript, and they don't like all the plumbing that it requires and all the education that it requires to stay up on the libraries and the stacks and the tools. And it's a lot. And, only the top so many percent of developers that actually set out to learn this stuff go on to be productive developers with it. It's really, really hard. So coming from a .NET world, coming from C#, coming from WPF, coming from web forms, this is your thing. And if you liked, you got a taste of Silverlight and you liked it and it worked, I've never been more productive using with a web application development technology as I have been with Blazor. Never been more productive. Okay, we'll move on. So the Blazor client hosting model is radically different and radically more simple. You basically load everything into the browser the first time it runs. Everything goes into the browser cache, which is controlled by the user, right? So if the user wants to hit Control F5, they got to take that hit again. We'll see how much that is in just a second. But if they want to expire the cache, fine, they're going to have to download things again. But essentially what happens is, remember I told you about WebAssembly being a virtual machine that's in the browser. So it's a binary machine. It's a very efficient binary virtual machine, and languages compile to a WASM file, which is the binary. It's like an exe file for Windows, right? That is the binary WASM WebAssembly app code, right? When we look in the browser, you're going to see things are a little bit different with Blazor. And so let's do that now. Let's watch the traffic with the browser tools with a WebAssembly application. And I'm just going to add to the solution a new project, a Blazor app, but this time it's going to be a WebAssembly app, and I'll call it Blazor WASM. Now you're going to see an undocumented feature of the latest Visual Studio Preview. Where did my WebAssembly template go? Well, if you click .NET Core up here, 3.0, and then back to 3.1, it will magically reappear. Ooh, workaround. Now how much would you pay? All right, take a look at these two options right here. One of them is for progressive web applications. So in the latest drop, Preview 3 of Blazor WebAssembly template, we have built-in support for PWAs. Now, of course, it's a skeleton, and if you want to do all the caching and everything, you have to add that, and you have to know what you're doing. But it adds the files for you. And, you know, you can just install this to change the URLs and install it somewhere in a service and run it on a phone, and you'll be able to put it on your home screen. I'm going to check this guy off, though, ASP.NET Core hosted. And the reason for that is, if I didn't check it off and I created a project, I would just get one project when I create a project here, a WebAssembly project. And that WebAssembly project, you know, it'd be fine. It would run in the browser and everything. But what if you want a server to host some APIs? Because now that everything's running in the browser, you can't just reach out to a database or whatever. You need to do all of your sensitive code, anything that requires secrets or authentication or any of that. You want to do that from an API layer. So this gives you a server project that hosts the client project. And it actually gives you 3 projects. It gives you another one that's just a shared .NET Standard project where you can put models and things. Here, I'll get out of the way real quick and zoom in here. So you can see these 3 projects. Here's your shared project that has the model weather forecast in it. Here's your .NET Core server with controllers. All right, that's all it is. It's just for controllers, but it also hosts this Blazor WASM client. All right, so it's not a Blazor server application. It's just a .NET Core server that hosts the client. So that means the client can call into these controllers with relative URLs because it's the same app, right? So this is good. This is good to have. What I will do right off the bat is set Blazor WASM server as the default project. Run this again. And we'll watch the network traffic with the WebAssembly version. Here I am again. So, network tools, F12. Here's my network. Definitely want to disable the cache. Start recording, and I'm just going to press Control F5, and we'll see what happens. Wow, a lot of stuff here, right? Let's take a look. First of all, let's see how much data was transferred. Well, 16.6 megabytes got packed up into 6 megabytes because it was compressed. 6 megabytes, that's a lot, relatively. I mean, Gmail is 5 megabytes. And Angular, I have no idea what that is, but it's probably pretty similar. But the reason that it's high is because in this preview, they turned off the linker in debug mode. So while you're debugging in debug mode, the linker is off. And that means that all of the entire base class library is sent down to the browser. Whereas if the linker is on, like for example in release mode, let's do that now. If you just make this release mode and run it again, now the linker is on, it will link out anything that isn't called, which is just about a lot right now, right? So let's see what happens here. Press F12, look at my network, disable the cache, Control F5. And now 1.9 megs were transferred. Yeah, that's better. Okay, so let's take a look and see what these files are, and we'll sort by size. Go up to the top here. .NET WASM is the largest file. That is a mono version of the CLR. So that is the binary that runs on WebAssembly, right? That is the binary. That is the manager. That's the managed code magic thing, the common language runtime. This is the runtime that all .NET code runs in. And the rest of these DLLs are .NET Standard 2.0 DLLs, right? All the things that we need. And of course, you know, JavaScript files and things like that. So big difference, right? And if I go to, say, counter, and I increment the counter, I don't see any additional traffic. Well, that's because there is none required. It's all running in the browser. So big difference. Big difference. All right, let's get back to here for a minute. We'll talk about the benefits and the drawbacks of the WebAssembly model. On the plus side, the code executes more quickly because it doesn't have that extra latency for the UI round trip. Okay? It's just pure code running in the browser. There is offline support through progressive web applications. Basically, you can cache the data. You can load and save it to local storage. There's all sorts of offline scenarios. You can distribute it with a CDN, with a content delivery network. And again, any .NET Standard 2.0 assemblies will run in the browser. So it's very compatible with a lot of .NET Core. Downsides. You can't do anything that requires secrets, right? Just like you would in JavaScript. You wouldn't have a database connection string and have JavaScript try to connect to it and do all that stuff. There is no SQL data adapter for JavaScript, and that's why. Maybe there is on the the server side, right? But there isn't certainly for browser side stuff. So basically, anything that requires any kind of secret, you have to make an API layer for. Debugging is there. You know, you can you can put a breakpoint on there, but there are limitations. It's not completely baked right now. Also, it's still in preview until May. Actually, it's in preview until .NET 5 ships in November. But what happens in May is, even though the component model is completely baked right now, in May, all the plumbing code will not change. You know, this is like release candidate. All the plumbing code will not change after the May release. All right, but again, the component model is completely compatible right now with the end result because Blazor is using it, counts on it heavily. It's not going to change. So it will ship in November with .NET 5. Your code is sent to the client. Again, I don't see this as a downside, but I did mention it here because some people are like, well, anybody can just decompile my code. Yeah, But guess what? They can look at your JavaScript too. And it's been that way since the beginning of time. The beginning of JavaScript, it's been that way. So anyway, the also right now the downsides are mostly in Visual Studio, right? The buggy things, the things that are quirky. Blazor itself is really, really solid. But Visual Studio is just trying to catch up. The tooling is always behind, right? So, any other questions on Blazor WebAssembly? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller, 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 Bueller. There's another thing that I'll mention right now, which is a website you can go to right now called WASI, WASI.dev. This is an initiative to get WebAssembly running outside the browser and interacting with the operating system. So it's something to watch. I mean, if they nail that, if they nail the way it can interact with the system, then all bets are off. WASM scale properties. Well, let's think about this, shall we? It's running in the browser. There is no server. So if you have an API server, that scales the same way it would scale today. But you really don't need to worry about scaling with a WebAssembly app because it's all running in the browser. Now there's lots of features and things that you can take advantage of. We'll talk about those, but server memory requirements, CPU, yeah, it doesn't apply for WebAssembly. All right, we move on. Again, Don's doing a really good job of answering your questions there in the chat room. So if you have any questions that I missed, just ask Don. He's more than happy to help. All right, so let's talk about binding. And somebody said you're going to either love or hate the binding syntax. I think you're going to love it. The binding syntax is so easy and so elegant and extensive that they really just got rid of a lot of cruft, which is always a good thing. I'm not going to read this slide to you, piece by piece and line by line. I'm actually just going to show you some binding code. So let's go back to Visual Studio. First of all, I'm going to go back to debug mode, and I'll go back to the server being the startup project and pull up index razor. And I'm just going to bring in some code here to show a little bit of binding. All right, so pretty simple looking. Here's a message string, and it's a property, so I've initialized it. It's going to show in a header up here with a one-way binding, but now there's a two-way binding here. Two-way means we can set the value, not just read it. So at bind says bind this member, whatever it is, to the default property of the input tag. Now the default property is value. Well, if I want to bind to something other than value for any kind of binding, I can use dash and then the property name. So this does the same thing, except it's a bit more explicit, right? So let's take a look and watch this happen in real time. So here we go, a two-way bound message. I'm going to say changed the message, and now I'm going to tab off it. And the reason I have to tab off it in order for it to update is because onChanged is the DOM event that triggers the binding to map to all of the variables that that are bound, right? So when I hit tab, the message property is going to update. And now because it's bound, one-way bound in that label, it shows up there. Now what if I want to change that default event that updates the binding? I can do that with @bind::event equals, and then whatever event I want. So if I want it on every key press, I say on input. Okay? So now I've basically told Blazor that I want the key press or on input event to force an update to message, which then forces it in the UI. There you go. Now we're going to create a component. And to do that, I'm going to right-click on my Pages folder, and I'm going to add a new Razor component right there in the context menu, Razor component. So all pages are also components. The only thing that makes them a page is that page directive right there. Right? Otherwise, it's a component like a custom control that you can instantiate in a page or in another component. So I will call this child component .razor. Now here's another undocumented feature that's just going to sit here forever. Just close the file, reopen it. That's the fix. This is all Visual Studio stuff. This isn't Blazor. All right, so let's look at this. Nope, not yet. Let's actually look at the child component. That's the wrong one. This is the one for child component. All right. So I've got a div, and I got some inline styling here. I want some padding and the background color to be light gray because I want to visually set it apart from the parent, which is index. And then I've got this parent message string property, and I'm showing that up here. And when I click a button, I want to call this update message method that changes the parent message. But now I've got this event. Look at this. And these are both parameters. And the parameter attribute says, oh, I want this to be exposed outside of the component to the parent. All right? Think of them as public properties and events that the caller who has a reference to you can set. And you can set them just when you instantiate the code as well. So this is how we define an event, with an event callback of whatever. This event passes a string. It's called message changed. Here, I can make any method async just by changing void to async task. Now I can call await, message changed, which is my event, invoke async, which invokes the event or raises the event, passing parent message. All right. So again, we have this parent message that we can bind to in the parent, and we also have an event that gets raised when we click this button. So update message is going to change parent message and update the event. Now in index, let's instantiate the child component. So this is the only difference, is this child component instantiation right here. Look at this. We're the same as before with our input. We're binding the value to message and selecting the keystroke as the event that causes it to change. We're showing it up here in a header, but we're also instantiating a child component, and we're binding its parent message property to our message property. So that inextricably links them. Whenever I press a key, not only is it going to change here, but it's going to change the parent message property of this child component. Furthermore, the event that changes the parent message in our message, right, is going to be message changed. I don't even need an event handler. I mean, I could have one if I wanted to, but I don't need one. I can just set the event to message changed. And when that event occurs, boom, my message gets updated. Right? So it's in the input, it's in our index, and it's also shown as I type in the component. Now, from the component, I'm going to change it by clicking this button. Poof, everything updates. Pretty cool, huh? Look how elegant. Just behold. Beautiful. Simple, beautiful, elegant. Just take a moment to reflect on that. Okay, that's enough time. All right. So that's binding. Now let's talk about handling state. So by default, when you, and I'm going to leave this because I'm going to show you all this stuff. You don't need to read it. So by default, let's go to the counter here and run the counter page again. Every time you navigate to a page, it gets reinitialized. Here's the count of 6. I'll go back to the home page, and now back to the counter, gets reset to 0. That's because the counter, this current count, is a page level or module level variable, and these all get reinitialized on navigation. So just so that you can see, I can override, and this is lovely, hang on one second. I can override a virtual method called not on after render. You know, guess I should look before pressing tab, huh? On initialized. On initialized is one of the 4 lifecycle events that you can override, these virtual events. And it happens first, and then on parameters set happens, and then on after render happens after a render. Just I want to show you something. This is out of curiosity. What happens here by default, I'm going to run this counter page. On initialized happens. And then, okay, why didn't it happen again? It usually happens again. And the reason why is this pre-rendered. If you pre-render, the render mode is pre-rendering, it renders once before it connects to the client and once after it connects to the client. So, and it's interesting why it only happened once there. It should have happened twice. But I just wanted to show you and hook that so that you could see the counter page being initialized. So the first step in managing state is to move anything that we're showing in the page out of the page. So let's do that by making a class called appState. Doesn't matter what you call it, but appState seemed to be fitting for me. And we'll just have one property in here, a count or a counter. Sorry. All right. Should have CodeRush installed. Yes, I get you. All right, so there it is, appState counter. Now let's add this counter as a service. I'm in startup CS here, and I'm going to add a scoped service called appState of the appState type. Now what does this do? Add singleton, add scoped. A singleton, like the weather forecast service is a singleton, means that there's one instance of this class that is shared among all clients. Add scoped means I want a different instance per client. So this is the perfect way to handle state. So now I can inject that app state instance into any page, and it will be the same instance page for page, right? Doesn't matter what page I inject it into, it's not going to create another new instance. We get the same instance. So now I can completely remove this current count, and I can replace these with app state counter. So here's our counter. Click the button a bunch of times. Navigate home, navigate back, and it's still set. So that's step one. Now, the problem is, of course, if I refresh, it gets reinitialized to 0 because I've reloaded the page. So now we got to think about persisting app state somewhere. Loading it back, all of that. Well, we could do a couple of things. We could use local storage, or we could, ship it off to some server, some document database somewhere, and put in a key like the user ID that we can retrieve it from and save it with. But that is the general idea. You do not have like a session system that's opinionated as to how to, persist data. You need to do that however you can. It's up to you. I do want to bring up this blog post that I wrote. You can just go to blog.appvnext.com. It's a shopping cart demo, very simple shopping cart, so it's easy to understand. Literally 3 classes, 3 models, and you basically persist it into local storage, and you give it a timeout. So by default, it's like 30 seconds. And you can change it, of course. So if you restart your app within 30 seconds, it loads it from local storage, and there you have your shopping cart again. Really cool and worth watching, because you would use the same technique with the same kind of state provider that this application uses if you were going to, say, go to a database. All right, this is perhaps the coolest thing you're going to see today. I think this is it just tickles me when I heard about this. Don Webier from Dev Express actually saw Steve Sanderson show this in his class. I had taken a 2-day Blazor workshop with Steve Sanderson at NDC London, so I didn't see his advanced Blazor class, but Don told me, oh my God, this is awesome. So, and I asked Steve, hey, this is really cool. How, where's the blog post? Where's the white paper? He's like, oh, no, just go over to my GitHub repo and my demos, and here's the line of code that you need to look at. He's just very, nonchalant. I'm like, well, do you mind if I blog this? He goes, no, please do. So, yeah, so this is a technique, and it was especially helpful before we had debugging, even a little bit of debugging in Blazor WASM. The whole idea is that you can develop from one code base, from one set of markup and code, an application that will run as a Blazor server app and an application that will run it as a WebAssembly app. And you can do them both at the same time. In fact, have 2 browsers open. One's running in the browser, one's running on the server, and it's the same code. So let's figure out how to do that, shall we? There's only 3 steps, really. Now you can see I've got, if you remember, I've got my Blazor server, which is my server-side Blazor application. I have my Blazor WASM client, which is the Blazor app running in the browser, and Blazor WASM server, which serves that client app. And then I have a shared project, right? So what I'm going to do is add a reference from Blazor server, a project reference. Add project reference to both Blazor WASM client and Blazor WASM shared, so I can access that code base from my server application. Then I'm going to go into host, where, remember I told you about the underscore host file and this app right there. Well, that app is everything that your, all of the markup and code for your application. So I'm going to change that to Blazor WASM. And I'm not getting any IntelliSense here. This is just wonderful because you know, sometimes that happens with Visual Studio. Just close the documents, save them, open it again. There you go. Now there's a light green reference there. So Blazor WASM .client.app. Change the render mode to server so there's no pre-rendering. There's certainly no pre-rendering on the client, and you want them to behave the same. So there's that. Now, if I were to just run Blazor server, it would run the code that's here in Blazor WASM client, but I want to run them both at the same time. So I'm going to go to my solution properties and set multiple startup projects. The first one is going to be my server-side Blazor app. Second one is going to be Blazor WASM server, which runs the WebAssembly app. So both of these are going to start and run at the same time. Just because I'm going to rebuild the solution. Sometimes Visual Studio is like, what do you want me to do again? So, and now we're going to get two browsers. Count them, two browsers. 1, 2. Have 2 bananas. And this code is running, is the code from Blazor WASM. It's the same code. Do you remember on Blazor server I had changed the index to have all that binding stuff? Well, that's not there anymore. And I got the counter. It's the same code running in 2 different hosting models at the same time. Now, what could go wrong? All right, well, first of all, check out this message. An unhandled exception has occurred. See browser dev tools for details. No, if you're in release mode, you're not going to get a you know, check out the debugging tools message. It's a little different, but let's just go ahead and look and see what happened on the server side. And why is it different, right? I thought we could run the code on the server and on the client at the same time. And yes, that's true. But let's just investigate and we'll see what happened. There's no registered service of type systemnet HTTP client. Why did that happen on the server and not on the client? Well, let's take a look on the client at fetch data razor. Fetch data razor calls an API on the client side, and it needs access to that HTTP client in the environment that it's running in, right? So either in the browser or in the server. But if you look on the server side, fetch data, which we are not running, we're not calling an API. We're just accessing, we're injecting this weather forecast service. And that is over here in the data folder, right there. And it's just a service that returns some, you know, one of these weather forecast models. But that's on the server side. But we're not running that server side code. We're running the client side code on the server. And it doesn't have access to HTTP client. So let's give it access. Let's give it a service in startup. Services. Add scoped. System net HTTP client. Okay. Now let's see what happens, because that was the error, right? Do you think that's it? Think we're out of the weeds yet? Dun, dun, dun. Let's see. Here's Blazor server. You can tell, right? Blazor server at the top, Blazor WASM at the top of this one. So the one on the right's the server side. So let's fetch the data again. Nope, we're not out of the weeds yet because the URL is relative. Has to be absolute or the base address must be set. And in that code, the fetch data code running on the client, that's the URL, which works fine because it's when it's running on the client, it calls into its hosted server for the weather forecast controller, right? So it doesn't need a fully qualified URL. And this is the weather forecast controller is just an API controller. But from the environment of the server, it doesn't know what that is. So let's go back to fetch data, and we're going to make a fully qualified URL for this. In order to do that, we need to know the port that the Blazor WASM server is running on, and that's in launch settings JSON under the properties folder. So I'll go over there. Here's the SSL port right there, 44398. I'll copy that. And now we can change this to HTTPS localhost : port number / weather forecast. And now everything should work just fine. All right, notice that the server runs quicker, right? A lot less data to load up. And there you go. There's your weather forecast. And over here in the client, yeah, it's a doesn't have to be a fully qualified URL, but it works. And so the moral of the story is the same resources have to be available in both environments. And the environment meaning the browser environment, and on the host, it's the server services on the server side. They all have to be there. Isn't that cool? I thought you'd like that. Any questions on that before we move on? Yes, it is documented in the docs. It's in the sample code, and it's also in the hands-on lab. It goes through the whole steps as to how to do that. Or you're talking about something else, Baraka. You're not talking about this. You're talking about some DevExpress stuff. Okay. All right. Let's talk about the big application that I'm going to demo here. It's actually a smaller version of a big application. The big application is, well, it's Band Booker, and I'll tell you about what it does in a minute, but the big one has a lot more features in it, like persistence to a database through Entity Framework, which this version I'm going to show you doesn't do any data persistence. It's just all in-memory models and stuff. And also, there's 2 of 5 models implemented, UI for those models implemented here that I'm going to show you. Also, in the big version, there's a SignalR hub added to do real-time collaboration. And by that, I mean any time that there's a database operation to, add, update, or delete a record, a message gets sent through my own SignalR hub that I added, and then every other client gets a message, hey, this was added, this was updated, this was deleted, and then things just happen magically in those clients. So that happens in the big version. Also, the authentication, the authorization stuff is a little bit more in depth. It's role-based. In the big application, we don't get into roles here, although it's completely possible. We're just not doing that. But here's the app. It's Band Booker, and it came to pass out of a necessity because I play in a band with 9 other guys and girls, and it's hard getting everybody together for a rehearsal, but it's even harder to book a gig when a venue calls me and says, hey, we got these dates in whatever next couple months. What are your availabilities? And I have to send an email to everybody in the band, and they have to respond back, and I have to hunt them down and chase them down and keep a spreadsheet, figure out who said yes, who didn't say yes, and it's like herding cats. So I built this application to, so that they could log in and for every potential gig say whether they could play or whether they couldn't play. And I presented them with this, and I actually built this to teach myself Blazor. This was my, sort of the big application that I decided to embark upon for learning purposes. And I presented it to the band. They're like, nah, we'll just use email. Because there's no incentive for them to learn a new system when email works fine for them, but it means that I have to, have spreadsheets and hound everybody all the time. So anyway, if you want to check out the workshop video and the hands-on lab and download the full version of this, it's at blazor.appvnext.com. And I will be doing, excuse me while I blow my nose, I will be doing live hands-on lab 1 day or 2 day courses around that whole band booker thing. I suspended them because the code was in flux. All right. So this is what we're going to learn. Hey, stop that. Hey, this is what we're going to learn. I'm going to teach you the code behind technique, which is using the power of the Visual Studio Editor to move code from those code blocks into classes for components and pages. Input validation, some really powerful stuff built into Blazor. I'll show you that. Show you JavaScript interop. So in the case there are things that Blazor can't do by itself, we want to call into JavaScript to do. That's not always the case, but sometimes it is. In this case, I wanted to set focus. When I pull up a component, I want to make the first input control have focus. There wasn't any way to do that without JavaScript. There still isn't. And also, if you have completed JavaScript widgets in things that you want to now access in C#, you can build a component and interop your way around all the properties and methods and everything else. So really kind of some cool stuff. And then generic components. I'm going to show you how to build your components where the data types are defined at runtime. And that's really important if you're going to make reusable components. I'm also going to talk about authentication and authorization using JOT tokens and API controllers. This is using ASP.NET Core Identity. The code itself was shamelessly pilfered from Chris Sainty's blog post here, and he gave me permission to use it in the app, and it's just really great. It's a little more work than just checking off the I want authentication and authorization with .NET Core Identity, which you can do in Blazor. You can do it in both WebAssembly now and in server, but you don't get ultimate flexibility. So the way I've done it, I've actually built my own UI for it, and I have the JOT tokens are stored in local storage. It's pretty cool, and it works well, just as well for Blazor WASM, Blazor Server as it does for Blazor WASM. So let's take a look at Band Booker, shall we? I will close this and pull up Band Booker, the completed version. And I'm just going to run it. You can see that it's using the same sort of model as I was using before, where I've got all 4 projects here. Let me close all this. We don't need never mind. Plus Visual Studio is going to freak out anyway. So I'm just going to start my multiple projects, and you'll see both the browsers open and running. So I can't do anything unless I'm logged in. Over here in the WASM version, once it loads up, I will log out, and you'll see that my view says, please register or log in to use this app. Over here on the server side version, I'm logged in, and so I can use the app. So I'll use this as a demo. So I have instruments and I have musicians. An instrument just has a name, and then musicians have a list of instruments as well as a name. Pretty simple, simplified for this demo, but there it is. So notice first of all that my edit and delete buttons are disabled until I select an instrument. And then when I edit, this is an editor component, right? It's called instrument editor. And notice that it has focus. I did that, and it also selects. So if I just started typing right here, that would be the name of the guitar, so the instrument. So if I type more than 50 characters and I tab off it, I get this validation that says the name is too long. And if I likewise try to update with no name, it's going to tell me the name field is required. It's not going to allow me to do it. So of course I can cancel it and everything's fine. Likewise, if I do a new instrument, you notice the flashing caret there. All right, it has focus. That's my JavaScript interop. Down here, let's look at a musician. I've got a component here that's generic. And the reason it's generic, the reason I made a generic component is because I want to reuse this UI in the band block where I'm editing a band, because a band is nothing more than a collection of musicians and some other metadata, right? Name, URL, website, whatever, photo. So here, this is probably UI you've seen before. I can double click to move things around. Basically, you have a finite list of things, and they can only exist in one list or the other. Right? So here's the list of all the items. Here's the list of selected items. I can say that Shredding Shelly plays guitar, update. Right? I can create a new musician. Let's actually create a new instrument too. So I'll make a conga over here, and I'll add that as an instrument. And down here, I'll have Che, who plays conga, and add that. And that is pretty much the UI. Also, notice that when I edit something, whatever it is, that these buttons are now disabled, and so is the select disabled. Really, the only things I should be able to do are press update and cancel. All right. So we've got the authentication. We've got generic components. We've got JavaScript interop. Let's look at code behind. Right here in the index, I'll come back to the authorized view, but it should be pretty obvious what that does. This index file has no code, and the way that I did that was I added a class called index.razor, same name, .cs. I made it partial and inherit from component base. And then I just moved all the code in here and made all of the members protected that I want to expose to the UI. And so with that, you can just do that with anything. I did it with the counter in the last workshop. Just moved the counter into a partial class from component base, and protected current count and increment count, and then everything works just as easily as it would before. All right, so let's get back to the authentication, the authorization, the authorized view. In an authorized view, I've wrapped an authorized block with all my UI code and a not authorized block that says please register or log in to use this app. So right now there's no roles defined, but I could easily add roles to this authorized view. And I could say only if you're, an administrator would you want to be able to add instruments and all that stuff. And in my big project that I told you about at blazor.appvnext.com, I have role-based security as well. So you have a manager role that can see all this stuff, and you have a musician role that can see a special page just for musicians. All right, so there's the authorized view. Let's take a look at the first component, the instrument editor component. And that is right here. There's a bunch of stuff to look at here, both validation and JavaScript interop. First of all, here's a really neat way that you can show and hide UI, just a Boolean. If the Boolean is true, show the UI. If not, don't show it. So that's how I can show and hide the component when it's instantiated. Because we're using the annotations, the data annotations validator, let's take a look at the instrument model. And the instrument model has two annotations. One says it's a required field, the name property is required, and the maximum string length is 50. And, name is too long, name must be 50 characters or whatever. There you go, you can set that message. So I have an edit form that I have to wrap my input tag in. The model is the object that I'm editing here, edit instrument, which is a new instrument object. And then on valid submit, all right, I don't want to just have a submit button and the on click go to whatever, because it's only going to let me go to the button click event handler if all the validation passes. So that's why on valid submit is right here. The data annotations validator says use those annotations that are in the model. The validation summary displays a summary of all of the problems, if there are problems, in red. Now I have an input text, and an input text could be just like that. It's essentially an input element, but it's a Blazor version of that, so it has smarts in there to handle validation. So then I have my submit button, type submit, and I have a cancel button. And by the way, the text is going to be either add or update, depending on what we're doing here. And then my cancel button, I have to make it type equals button, otherwise it's going to be considered a submit button also. So there you go. Now you can see I have parameters and event callbacks just like you've seen before. Here's the JavaScript interop, right? So in order to do that, I inject an IJS runtime, and I call it JS. And when I click new instrument, I'm going to call the setFocus method in JavaScript. Where is that actually? Well, it has to be in both environments. So this is one of those things that has to be there on both sides. On the client, it's, in Ben Booker WASM client, it's index HTML in the web root. I'll look there first. Here's my function, setFocus. I'll talk about it in a second. And on the server, it's in _host CSHTML. There it is, setFocus. All right, so take a look at this and just explore the weirdness here for a minute. This is a stupid JavaScript trick, and I'll tell you why I did this. Rather than just calling, getting the document element by ID, which I passed in, and then calling focus and select, I'm doing a little timing trick here where I'm calling this internal focus method function, in 10 milliseconds. So I'm waiting 10 milliseconds, and then I'm calling it, passing the ID. If I don't get an element reference, I'm going to call myself in another 10 milliseconds. How long does it take? I don't know, 100 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds, I really don't know. But I'm just going to keep calling myself every 10 milliseconds until I get an element reference. And then I'll call focus and select. Well, why am I doing that? It's a good question. So getting back to index razor, right? I have the new button that calls new instrument button click. Let's just take a look at this one. New instrument button click. What is this instrument editor right there? Let's take a look at that. What's that? Well, this is an instance of instrument editor, my component. Now, the reason I can grab that reference is because of this @ref right there. @ref equals instrument editor. So now I have a reference that I can call into. All right, so I call the new instrument button click right there. It calls the new instrument method on the component. And I have a Boolean that tells me whether I'm adding or not, and I am. I have my submit button text. I have an edit instrument, which I'm editing with the form. And show instrument panel, setting it to true so that the UI actually displays. And then I'm invoking asynchronously this JavaScript method setFocus, passing instrument name, which is the ID of my input text, right? Here's the thing. Here's where I set the show instrument panel to true. This isn't going to exist in the DOM until a round trip occurs, or at least until I clear the stack. So I can't actually access it right there. It doesn't exist. This guy doesn't exist yet when I call the JavaScript. As soon as I leave and exit and other things happen, then it will work. And you might be asking yourself, well, why not just use this? On after render. And just call your JavaScript right there. So on after render happens after the whole page has completed and it's been rendered, and now I can do what I want. Well, the reason is that because now I have to do some state management. What state are we in here, right? I don't know, and I don't want to call setFocus every time the page renders. That's crazy. I only want to set it once. So that's why I opted for the stupid JavaScript trick of the timeout. And you know, it's a SPA problem. It's not a Blazor problem. This is just an architectural problem for SPAs. Sometimes those elements don't exist on the page, but we know they're going to. So we just wait until they do, and then we do what we need to do. Authentication. I am going to spend a little bit of time on that. There's a lot of moving parts to it, but let's start with the APIs. So there's an accounts controller in controllers. Now this is happening on Bandbooker WASM server, because remember, all the code is happening in Bandbooker WASM client. None of this stuff is working here. In fact, you can see I've deleted all the other pages. So there is no index or anything here. I've deleted them just to show you that this is what we're doing. We're using the UI and markup from Bandbooker WASM client. So on the server, we have this accounts controller, and this is going to be used to register. And we're just using the identity user, and we have a user manager, essentially, which is from ASP.NET Core Identity, user manager. We've got some models here. A register model, which has an email and a password, confirmed password. A register result, which tells us if we were successful or gives us a list of error strings. We have a user model that has the email and whether they're authenticated. Then there's a login controller, and the login controller allows you to log in, and if everything is good, we create some claims, and we create the name and the email claim, and the name claim, if you will, the email. And then we use some voodoo here to create a JOT token and add that token to the result. The login result right here has a JOT token, right? And now how do we save that? Well, let's talk about how we call from the client into this API. there's actually a service. Where are we here? Yeah, a service called auth service, which has a register, a login, and a logout. And when we log in, we're deserializing the result, and we're using local storage to set the token in there. And through an API authentication state provider, which we've also written, we are marking the user as authenticated. So all of that stuff, and then we have our pages. We have a register page. Here we are. Where's my register page? We have a register page with an edit form, right? And that calls into auth service register, and if it's successful, we navigate to login. Here's the login page. We have our model. We call the auth service login, and if it's successful, we just navigate to the main page. And that's where the authentication, the authorization stuff takes over when we navigate to the page. So very cool. This is a pretty big project, as you can see. The object picker is the last thing I want to talk about. This is the generic component, and this is what makes it generic, a type param. T item now becomes the type that we're going to expose in here. And so you see here I've got a parameter that's called all items, which is a list of T item, which in this case is my instruments. A list of selected items, also a list of instruments, and a selected item that is of type T item. And I have the item type in the plural version of that, which are just strings used for UI. And then I have the property, the name of the text property, which in the case of an instrument is name, and the value property name, which is ID, because ID is the identifier, right? So we need those things because up here, this is just a table, right? And here's a select, and we're looking to see if this item is the selected item. We're doing that by comparing item value, or the ID. And item value and item text use a little bit of reflection with the value property name and the text property name to pull those values out of the item. So those are the things you have to think about when you're making generic components. Let's see, I think I covered all the bases. Just suffice it to say that, you know, there's a lot of code here, right? So now let's go back to my slideshow and talk a little bit about deployment. Okay, well, this is pretty much a duh slide, but here's something that you need to know. When you're deploying a Blazor server application to Azure, you need to, in the app service, enable WebSockets. It's disabled by default. And just go into the Azure app service configuration properties, and it's just a switch. You turn it on, WebSockets, enable it. All right, let's talk about DevExpress, and make some noise in the chat room if you are currently a DevExpress customer and use their tools. DevExpress has been around for over 20 years. They started but with Delphi components, and of course Mark Miller is the chief architect, I believe that's his title, of the components of developer tools. Also wrote Code Rush. So these guys are still supporting those Delphi controls right now. And there's only a handful of people in the world that use them, but they're still being supported. So these guys have been around a long time, and they really know what they're doing. They've got a full suite of controls for Windows Forms, for web forms, for MVC, for all sorts of things. They got code generators and test kits and all sorts of things. But they also have made available to you for free a suite of Blazor components. And these include a grid and a scheduler and some charts and primitives, a file upload control, list boxes, multi-select list boxes, good stuff. And I just want to show you, can I just show you something from DevExpress really quickly? This is their scheduler. I'm just going to pull it up in a browser. Look at their demos, their Blazor demos. Just look at this scheduler here. This is really something special. This is like dropping Google Calendar into your application. It's true story. So you can move things around. You can have multiple items in here. I can create a new appointment. I can move it from here to here, right? Expand it. Look at this. This is crazy. Now here's the best part. Let's look at the code. Here's my markup. There's my code. What? That's insane, right? So the thing I really want to drive home here is this is a win-win for Developer Express, because out of all that code that I just showed you, they're focused on making it easy for you to get stuff done, to be very productive. So that means writing these components that pack a lot of features in them that you don't want to write. You don't have time to write. And this is free. Now, it's free right now. Of course, they will probably have, they're definitely going to have a subscription plan or something like that in the future. And you can ask Don and John, who are online here, about that. That's not my thing. But I just want to show you how productive you can be using their controls. And I'll show you, this is just a really good place to go exploring their controls. Editing, deleting, dealing with large data sources, right, that do paging and working with data that you have. Also, themes, like you can just change the Bootstrap theme if you want for these controls. They understand Bootstrap really well. Let me show you a demo that they did. They took my band booker application and they said, yeah, that's all very cool, Carl, and you got a lot of code there, but you know, it could be a lot more simple. And so they essentially did the whole instruments and musicians with a grid, with a couple of grids. So here I can edit a musician, or an instrument rather. Here's guitar. I'll put an S on it and update it. I'll add a new instrument, congas. I'll delete an instrument, drums. I'll edit a musician, piano Patty, and piano Patty plays keyboards. I'll update that. I'll create a new musician, Che, and Che plays congas. I can add another instrument if we want him to play guitars also. Update him. So there you go. So now none of the bells and whistles, but do you really need it? I mean, this is simplified productivity here. Here's the best part. Let's look at the markup. Here's the markup to support the instruments. Here's the markup to support the musicians. A little bit more because we have that built-in form. Now here's the code. Here's the code to support the instruments. Basic CRUD stuff. Here's the code to support the musicians. Right? That's productivity. That's getting stuff done. And I didn't have to do all that crazy UI. And it is good. It's good to do everything yourself, but you know, there are certain times when you just need to build a throwaway application maybe, or an application for your customers that is just to the point. They just want to edit stuff, right? They want to add records. They want to edit stuff. They want to delete records, whatever. Easy. Easy for you to do. Now here's another thing. A multi-select list box, you would think that that's built into Blazor. I have the standard, the same select that I've been using in the technique that I've been using for all of my code. This is it's a manual select, right? And this is my coronavirus shutdown reading list. So I have a single select list box. If I press control, nothing happens. All right, that's pretty obvious. But you would think that I could just do this, multiple, right? But here's the thing. When I go to book selected, this takes a change event args, right? And I pull out from that a single value. Even if it's multi-select, you're only going to get the last one you clicked on. And there isn't really any way in Blazor to go back and check all of these to see if they're selected or not. Right? So that becomes a problem. How do we do it? Well, I found this guy online who wrote this component, and I shamelessly stole it. Ash KE98 on medium.com. There's the code URL right there to this blog post. How could I handle select list, in other words, multi-select in Blazor? Well, he figured it out, and it's pretty complex. He's got a type param, right? It's a generic component. He's got a select with multiple, and he's got a cascading value here. And he's got some generic stuff in here on after render async. He's got invoking JavaScript. There's a lot of JavaScript, and this one is even invoked from JavaScript on option select. So the integration with JavaScript is really tight here. Let me show you where that is. All this JavaScript right here. So here we have multiple levels of if, a lot of cyclomatic complexity, and setting attributes, removing attributes. All right, getting arrays of options, returning results, and then invoking this .NET object, invoke method async on option select. So, you know, it's quite involved, and I'm not saying it doesn't work. It actually does. This is what that demo looks like. He's got our select multiple right here, and he's going through the books, and he's got some code that if no books are selected, we don't show them, and if we do have books selected, then I show each of these with a little div, and you'll see what it looks like here. And it does work, but that's not the point. The point is, you know, that's just for a multi-select list box. For anything else that I want, I don't want to have to go scour the internet and find something that some guy wrote in a blog post and use that in my code. So now you can see I've got my control key held down, and I can select and deselect. I can even hold down the shift key and select all of them. Okay. Now I'm going to bring on my friend Don Webier from DevExpress to show you how to do this the easy way. Don?
Hey Carl, that was a decent amount of work getting that multi-select feature enabled. But fortunately, there are easier ways of doing so by using the native DevExpress Blazor controls. And let me show you how simple that works. I have this page over here, and I have only prepared this property which will hold the selected books of the list box. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to insert the DevExpress list box here, where I will bind the data to the book service, and I'll specify a text field name, which will be in this case the property name, which will be displayed inside the list box. And then the last thing is I'm going to bind the selected items of the list box to the selected books property of the page. And this is basically all we need right now. Let me also include the code that you've seen before. There is one difference though, and that is instead of cycling through this list with IDs and stuff, you can now cycle directly through the selected books collection. And you can write out those property names straight away. So it's again a bit less code here. And once I run the application, let's see what happens now. If I go to the DevExpress demo, what we'll see is that we have the same UI as we had on the previous pages. The only thing right now is that if I hold down the Shift key or the Control key, it still selects one. Well, and that's actually quite simple solved, because right now the list box is in single selection mode. If I go back to the code and I'll add a property which I will change to the list box selection mode multiple, we're all set. So let's run a demo again, and I will now be using my Control and my Shift key as well. And what you'll see is I can select items individually or deselect them, or I can even hold the Shift key to select the whole batch. So that's quite simple, huh?
Yeah.
And there is one more thing I'd like to show, and that is setting another property. And that property is going to be show checkboxes. I'm going to put it to true, and now all of you may guess what this will do. So let's run it again, and what we have now is a really nice list box with checkboxes. And for single selections I don't even need to hold down the Control key, but I can still use the Shift key if I want. So if I want to select the whole batch, I'll just hold down the Shift. So a very nice and powerful control. And yeah, if we check the amount of code that was needed to get this desired UI, I would say this is too much, right?
No, it's for me the perfect amount. Listen, Don, thank you very much.
You're welcome, Carl, and we'll talk later.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye. So sorry about for my light flickering on and off there. I really don't know what's going on, but I think I'm going to get me some professional lights. Anyway, the point of that was obvious. DevExpress has done the hard work for you and makes you very productive when you're developing your own applications. So there's two ways to run the demos. You can the DevExpress Blazor demos online or locally. You can actually download the entire project with the source, and you can run them locally. If you're going to use DevExpress tools, you need to register, which is the very first thing you should do. Right now, we'd like you to download these tools and take them for a spin and see what you think. We think you're going to love it. Go to devexpress.com/freeblazor. The URL is all over our website. It's here. We'll post it again in the chat room. Then what you need to do is configure a private NuGet feed. You'll have your own special URL for that in Visual Studio. You go and install the NuGet package. You modify your HTML to include the Blazor CSS from DevExpress, and then you add your using statement, and you're off to the races. So here's a couple of URLs for important places at devexpress.com where you can keep up with what they're doing in Blazor. We have a roadmap and a community portal. And of course, if there's any questions at all, it's Blazor at devexpress.com, Blazor Roadshow at devexpress.com, Blazor Desk Show at devexpress.com. Just reach out if you have any questions at all. And with that, I would again encourage you to download your free copy of devexpress.com, free Blazor components. Use them forever. And thank you very much. And I'm going to put on some music, and we'll just hang out here for a little bit while we make sure that all your questions are answered. Okay, thanks very much.